Maria stood in the corner of the luxury penthouse, quietly wiping down the marble countertop while an expensive brunch unfolded around her. Laughter filled the room as designer-dressed guests clinked glasses and tossed careless glances in her direction. One woman, elegant and sharp-tongued, leaned over and muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "These maids always think they belong here." The laughter that followed burned into Maria's spine, but she didn't flinch. She smiled, nodded politely, and continued working. No one knew that her last name was on the LLC registration of the cleaning company that serviced every apartment in the building. No one knew that she owned 2 offices in San Francisco, 3 in Los Angeles, and had just finalized a contract with a Silicon Valley tech firm for exclusive services. And certainly no one knew that the woman being mocked had a nicer home, a bigger business, and more employees than the very people laughing at her. But they would learn. Today. The clinking of champagne glasses and soft hum of jazz filtered through the open terrace doors of the 50th floor penthouse overlooking downtown Los Angeles. Morning light spilled in across marble countertops and glimmered on crystal vases filled with imported white orchids. The brunch was in full swing, the kind that wrapped itself in subtle luxury, linen napkins folded like origami, pastries stacked like sculptures, and a guest list that read more like a Forbes sidebar than a circle of friends. Among the polished silver and curated laughter moved Maria, her uniform perfectly pressed, her movements quiet, efficient, nearly invisible. She navigated the room with the graceful anonymity that came from years of observation, always in the room but never part of it. She wiped the countertop with slow, deliberate strokes, not because it needed it, but because the gesture helped her stay centered. She was used to the looks. The upward glances that barely acknowledged her presence, the sudden silences when she entered a room mid-conversation, the way they moved their handbags subtly closer. But today, her focus was elsewhere. Her phone vibrated silently in her apron pocket, probably her assistant at the San Diego office confirming the new walkthrough scheduled for next week. She would respond later. For now, she played her role. The hostess, a woman named Genevieve with impeccably highlighted hair and a diamond ring the size of a baby's fist, moved through the crowd like she owned the air. Maria had worked dozens of events like this. She knew the rhythm, the curated authenticity, the tension beneath the politeness. Genevieve was polite but not kind. She'd made that clear within the first 5 minutes of Maria arriving that morning. The way she gave instructions without looking her in the eye, the clipped tone, the smile that ended half an inch before her mouth. Maria had long stopped reacting. Let them underestimate her. It made everything simpler. The guests began to settle into their places, sipping mimosas and nibbling on canapes. Maria refreshed the water glasses, moving silently from one guest to the next. The conversations were a blur of gallery openings, private schools, and second homes. She had heard it all before. The city was full of people who measured themselves by how high their windows were, not how solid their foundations remained. She paused near the edge of the dining room, close enough to hear but far enough to remain unacknowledged. Genevieve's voice rang out with a performative brightness as she spoke about the renovations to her Palm Springs property. One of the other women leaned in, laughing a little too loudly, then nodded in Maria's direction. It was subtle at first, a glance, a smirk, but then Genevieve followed up with a pointed comment about how these girls always linger, don't they? Like they think they're guests. A few heads turned, chuckles spilled awkwardly into their glasses. Maria caught the glance. She said nothing. Her posture didn't change. Her hand continued moving in small, deliberate circles across the polished surface of the table. Inside, however, she noted everything, the tone, the condescension, the timing. She'd seen this play before. It wasn't the first time someone dressed in wealth thought status gave them license to humiliate. It wouldn't be the last. But Maria didn't let it touch her. She folded the cloth over neatly, placed it back into the pocket of her apron, and turned to retrieve a tray from the kitchen. No one would guess that she owned the company servicing the building. No one would guess that this penthouse, this very space, was cleaned bi-weekly by a team hired, trained, and paid under her leadership. Her name wasn't stitched on the uniform, but it was signed on the paycheck. As she stepped into the butler's pantry, she glanced at her phone. 3 unread messages. One from her regional manager in San Jose confirming the onboarding of a new crew. One from her bookkeeper about a client transfer. And one from a real estate broker who had found a promising location in Sacramento. Another branch. Another opportunity. Maria smiled to herself only briefly before returning to the dining room with fresh cutlery wrapped in navy linen. The women were now engaged in a heated conversation about a recent country club scandal. Maria replaced the silver silently, her presence once again reduced to background. But she didn't mind. Let them see what they wanted to see, a domestic worker, humble and unremarkable. It had never bothered her. What did bother her was arrogance. Entitlement disguised as confidence. She had come from nothing and built something no one could take away. These women had inherited status. Maria had created hers. And the difference would show eventually. As she finished her loop around the table, she caught the eye of one of the quieter guests, a woman who didn't laugh when the others did. Their eyes met for half a second and Maria saw it, that flicker of recognition. The kind that comes when one woman sees the truth behind another's quiet. But it passed quickly and the guest turned away. Maria returned to the kitchen, breathing slowly, calmly. The brunch would last another hour. Then cleanup. Then invoices to approve, schedules to finalize, and a conference call with her HR team about employee retention strategies. Her life moved in two worlds, one where she was invisible and one where she was in control. She knew both intimately and that was her greatest strength. She poured another carafe of coffee, walked back toward the laughter and the crystal and the orchids, and waited. They didn't know who she was yet, but they would. The brunch continued with an effortless rhythm, the kind that only came from routines forged over money, leisure, and time. Servers moved like shadows between clinking forks and bursts of laughter. The sun had risen high now, flooding the penthouse with a golden sheen that bounced off glass surfaces and designer accessories. Maria kept her movements steady, her expression neutral, her posture perfectly controlled. She had been in enough rooms like this to know when the energy in the air was beginning to turn from idle chatter to something performative. It was subtle at first, a shift in tone, an extra pause after a sentence, the way one woman leaned in to whisper before tossing a casual glance across the room. Maria recognized it for what it was. Not interest. Not inclusion. It was preparation. Genevieve sat at the head of the table with a kind of elegance born of practiced superiority. Her hair curled in deliberate waves, her blouse perfectly silk, her posture just a degree more rigid than anyone else's. She held her mimosa like a prop, her voice lilting through the room as she recounted a story about a trip to Lake Como, about a boutique spa where the staff knew her by name and offered lavender towels before she even stepped inside. The women around her hung on the details, adding their own embellishments, turning the story into a round table of wealth affirmation. And then, as if the conversation needed punctuation, Genevieve's tone shifted just slightly, just enough. She gestured vaguely toward Maria, who was replacing empty plates at the far end of the room, and said something that could have been brushed off as a joke if not for the smirk curled at the edge of her lips. She spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, her words dancing in the air with a deliberate sharpness. You know, I always admire how some people find their way into the finer things. Even if it's just to clean them. The laugh that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Controlled. A blade wrapped in satin. One or two guests chuckled softly, unsure whether to join in or look away. Maria didn't flinch. She kept her back turned, setting the dishes down gently onto a serving tray. But her hands stilled for a second, her fingers resting against the porcelain a moment longer than necessary. She had heard worse in her life. Far worse. But what made the sting wasn't the insult itself, it was the smug certainty in Genevieve's voice, the confidence that no one in the room would challenge her, that humiliation was just another form of entertainment among the upper crust. Another comment followed, more pointed this time, wrapped in the language of faux empowerment. Something about how it must feel fulfilling to support other people's dreams through hard work, even if those dreams were never your own. Laughter again, this time louder. Maria turned then, calmly, and began collecting coffee cups. She walked to each guest with the same grace, the same quiet professionalism. She didn't break rhythm. She didn't offer a glance. But the air had shifted. And not just for her. The woman across the table, the same one who had met Maria's gaze earlier, lowered her cup without drinking. Her fingers traced the rim of the saucer absently, her brows furrowed just slightly. Others seemed less amused now, their smiles forced, their attention scattering. But Genevieve was too busy basking in her own moment to notice. She was the type who mistook silence for approval. She had built her identity on rooms that let her speak without consequence. Maria finished her loop around the table and stepped back into the kitchen. The moment she crossed the threshold, the noise softened. Behind her, the brunch resumed, but she no longer heard it as sound. It was static now, background to something clearer rising within her. She set the tray down, washed her hands slowly, and leaned against the counter for just a moment. She didn't feel shame. She didn't feel anger. What she felt was precision, the slow pull of resolve threading itself tighter in her chest. She looked at her phone again. The notification from her assistant was still there, blinking quietly on the screen. It was a reminder about a call later that afternoon to finalize a contract with a high-end real estate firm expanding into Orange County. It would be their 5th corporate client this quarter. She smiled to herself, a smile no one in the other room would see. They didn't know who she was, not yet. After the dishes were cleared and the laughter died down, Maria returned to the main room to collect linen napkins and clear wine glasses. She moved past Genevieve without acknowledgement, her face unreadable. Genevieve didn't look at her either. The moment had passed, and for her, that was the end of it. For Maria, it was only the beginning. As the final guests filed out, leaving behind the faint scent of perfume and too sweet champagne, Maria remained. She wiped the tables, folded the linens, arranged the cushions just as she had found them. The room looked untouched, as if no one had been there. That was her specialty, leaving spaces cleaner than they were, erasing the traces of people who never truly saw her. But some traces couldn't be wiped away. Not the memory of laughter. Not the echo of a voice slicing through the air like it held permission. Maria finished her final task, gathered her things, and walked out the door with the same quiet confidence she'd entered with. On the surface, nothing had changed. But the next time someone laughed at a uniform or dismissed a name or spoke like power only wore heels and silk, Maria would be ready, not with anger, but with proof. And soon, the woman who had ridiculed her would walk into a room she didn't own, asking for something she didn't expect, and find herself face to face with someone she had underestimated. And this time, Maria would be the one sitting at the head of the table. The day's sun had started its descent by the time Maria reached her car parked on a quiet side street 3 blocks away from the penthouse. She had chosen not to valet, not out of modesty, but out of habit. The beat-up SUV didn't match the sleek black Range Rovers and Teslas lined up at the curb, and that was precisely the point. She unlocked the door, folded her apron neatly, and placed it into the small box behind the driver's seat where she kept her uniforms. Her fingers lingered for a second on the fabric, then reached for her blazer draped over the passenger seat. It was tailored, dark navy, clean-cut. When she slid it on, it changed everything, not just how she looked, but how the world received her. The car started with a soft hum, and she pulled away from the curb without looking back at the glittering tower behind her. She didn't drive home. Instead, she headed south through the city, past the long stretches of concrete and graffiti-stained underpasses that divided one zip code from another. 45 minutes later, she pulled into the secured lot of a modest 2-story building just outside of Inglewood. The signage was subtle: Alta Cleaning Group, corporate offices. No glossy branding. No neon. Just clean lettering and a quiet presence. She parked in her designated space, Maria Delgado, CEO, and entered through the rear entrance using her keycard. Inside, the hum of a late working team greeted her. The front office was calm but active. A few employees were finalizing schedules, one was processing new hiring forms, and the operations manager was reviewing invoices at his desk. Maria offered a quiet wave, then made her way down the hallway to her corner office. The walls were lined with framed photos of her crews, group shots in matching polos, snapshots from company picnics, handwritten thank you notes from clients framed beneath glass. On one shelf sat a small framed photo of her and her son on the day she signed her first commercial contract. He had been only 8 at the time, and she still remembered how he'd insisted on dressing in a blazer for the occasion. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began combing through her inbox. Contracts, onboarding confirmations, site requests, maintenance reports. Her days were rarely glamorous, but they were always full. Her business had started with a mop, a bucket, and a Craigslist ad. Now it spanned 6 cities, employed over 100 full-time staff, and serviced more than 50 commercial properties, including 3 high-end residential towers in downtown LA, one of which housed the very penthouse she had cleaned that morning. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had built a company so successful that the people who hired her teams didn't even know her name. She had created systems that ran without her needing to step in, but she still chose to work the occasional gig in person, not out of necessity, but to remember. To stay grounded. To never forget where it all started. That evening, as she reviewed the proposal from the Silicon Valley tech firm looking to outsource facilities maintenance across their Bay Area campuses, her assistant buzzed in. A new lead had just come through via referral, one that had flagged Maria's private line for approval. She clicked into the details. It was a request from a residential address in Beverly Hills. A full-service cleaning estimate for a large estate. Weekly upkeep, laundry services, staff coordination. High-profile client. The name caught her attention, Brad and Genevieve Halvorsen. She leaned back in her chair. Genevieve? Of course. She read through the intake form slowly. The tone was polite, impersonal, filled with the language of someone used to requesting and receiving high-end service. The email didn't mention her by name, nor did it acknowledge the brunch. It had likely come through a third party, perhaps even a personal assistant unaware of the recent interaction. Maria's mind didn't race. It didn't flood with satisfaction or resentment. What she felt was something quieter, confirmation. Not revenge. Not power. Just the full-circle click of something inevitable. She glanced at the line in the email that read, "Looking for a company with discretion. Professionalism and high standards." She smiled softly. She replied to her assistant, confirming the request for a formal proposal and asking to schedule an in-person consultation. She wanted to deliver it herself. After sending the email, Maria rose from her desk and walked out to the operations room. Her managers greeted her with nods. She held a quick check-in, asked for updates on supplies, transportation needs, and feedback from new hires. It was work she had done 1,000 times before, but she never stopped taking it seriously. Each detail mattered. Each employee mattered. Before she left, she stopped by the training room where 2 new recruits were watching a video on protocol and etiquette. She greeted them, asked if they needed anything, and offered a few words of encouragement. They smiled, grateful that the woman who signed their paychecks also remembered their names. Driving home, Maria felt a stillness settle over her. Not quiet in the absence of noise, but calm in the presence of control. She had no interest in public confrontation or proving herself to people who had laughed behind her back. Her success wasn't for them. It was for her son, for her staff, for every woman who had ever been told to know her place. She had known her place from the beginning, and it had never been beneath anyone. As the freeway lights blurred past, she thought about the upcoming meeting with the Halvorsens. She would arrive dressed in the same quiet professionalism she always wore. She wouldn't mention the brunch. She wouldn't remind Genevieve of the things she had said. She wouldn't have to. The sun had just begun to climb above the line of tall hedges that flanked the Halvorsens' Beverly Hills estate when Maria stepped out of her vehicle. The front gates stood open as if the house itself were unaware of the moment about to unfold. She paused briefly to glance at the sprawling structure ahead, white stucco, black trim, expansive glass windows reflecting the manicured lawn and the cloudless sky. It was a home designed to impress, not invite. Everything about it suggested quiet opulence, the kind acquired over generations or through a particularly fortunate business deal. She approached the entrance with calm steps, carrying a sleek leather folder under her arm. Her blazer was immaculate, her heels understated, her presence both confident and restrained. She had no intention of making a scene. She came for business. A young assistant, no older than 25 and dressed in business casual, greeted her at the door. His smile was professional, almost mechanical, and he gestured for her to follow him through the foyer without asking her name. He assumed she was another service provider, perhaps an office manager, or even an assistant herself. Maria followed in silence, her eyes taking in the familiar signs of wealth. High ceilings, commissioned art pieces, imported flooring. These spaces had once made her feel small. Now they registered simply as potential workspaces. Business opportunities dressed in Italian marble. The assistant led her into a sun-filled lounge where 2 glasses of cucumber water sat untouched on a low table. The furniture was white and angular, the air faintly perfumed with something floral and expensive. Maria sat in the chair opposite the larger one, deliberately choosing the seat that wasn't meant to assert dominance. She opened her folder and reviewed the preliminary estimate while the assistant murmured something about his employer being on a call. Maria nodded without looking up. She wasn't in a rush. Time had already proven to be on her side. Footsteps clicked on the marble moments later. The door opened again, and in walked Genevieve Halvorsen, dressed in a pale linen pantsuit, her blonde hair pulled back into a casual chignon. Her smile was fixed, almost pleasant, but it faded within seconds. Her steps faltered just slightly. Maria looked up, eyes meeting hers with calm precision. There was no smile on Maria's face. No confrontation either. Just presence. Unapologetic, grounded, unshakable. Genevieve's expression flickered, confusion first, then realization. The pause was brief, but heavy. She glanced at the assistant. Then back at Maria, trying to process the disconnect between memory and setting. The woman who had served mimosas in silence at her brunch now sat calmly in her formal sitting room, dressed like a corporate executive, holding a folder embossed with a company logo. For a moment, Genevieve didn't speak. Maria didn't fill the silence. She waited. When Genevieve finally sat down, her posture was different than before, straighter, stiffer. The assistant excused himself with awkward politeness, sensing a shift in dynamic he couldn't explain. The room grew quiet again, save for the faint ticking of a designer wall clock. Maria turned a page in her folder and began speaking, her tone professional, steady, and completely detached from their last encounter. She walked through the proposed services: weekly residential cleaning, staff scheduling, specialty care for antique furnishings, and seasonal deep cleaning packages. Each word was delivered with the kind of practiced clarity that came not from memorization but from ownership. This was her language, her domain. Genevieve nodded along, still trying to catch up. Her responses were clipped, her earlier confidence diluted by discomfort. She hadn't apologized. Maria hadn't asked her to. That wasn't the point. Maria wasn't there to demand acknowledgement. Her presence was enough. Every moment they sat across from each other reinforced what needed to be said without words. The hierarchy Genevieve believed in no longer applied here. Whatever social script she had rehearsed before the meeting had become irrelevant. As the meeting progressed, Genevieve began asking questions about the staff rotation, about background checks, about billing. Maria answered each one calmly, thoroughly, with the precision of someone who had built each system herself. There were no gaps in her knowledge, no flinches when details got specific. She wasn't a figurehead. She was the architect. At one point, Genevieve asked about the company's founding. Maria gave her the condensed version, just enough to outline her experience without inviting sympathy. She mentioned that the company had been operating for over 10 years, had grown to cover multiple counties, and now serviced clients ranging from corporate headquarters to high-end private estates. She didn't mention the long nights, the rejections, or the times she had been told she was aiming too high. She didn't need to. The scale of her business spoke for itself. When the meeting concluded, Maria closed the folder and placed a single business card on the table. It was simple, white background, black font, her name at the center, president and founder beneath it. She pushed it forward slightly and stood. Genevieve reached for it with fingers that trembled just a little. Her smile this time was forced, tight at the edges. She murmured a vague thank you, still not quite looking Maria in the eye. As Maria turned to leave, she paused at the door, then glanced back, not with spite, not with triumph, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. She had been seen. Not for her job, not for her clothes, not for the assumptions others placed on her, but for the truth of who she was. In a house that once would have dwarfed her, she now moved with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she brought into any room. Outside, the morning light had softened, casting long shadows on the estate's marble facade. Maria stepped into the warmth without hesitation. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. There was power in walking away, not because she had proven anything, but because she no longer needed to. Genevieve stood alone in her expansive kitchen after Maria left, staring down at the small white business card now resting on the granite countertop. The name seemed to pulse in front of her eyes. President and founder. There was no elaborate branding, no flourish of color, just clean, elegant certainty. She turned the card over and back again, the silence in the house amplifying the echo of her own thoughts. It was the same woman. The one from the brunch. The one she had laughed about, mocked. And now it was her logo sitting on the service proposal that would soon govern every detail of this home's maintenance. There was a peculiar heaviness to the realization. For someone so used to being in control, Genevieve suddenly felt unsteady, like she had been walking across glass for years and never noticed the cracks until now. She called for her husband but stopped midway. What would she even say? That she had misjudged a woman who now owned more property than they did? That she had thrown words like knives at someone who was quietly building a corporate empire while wiping down her brunch table? No explanation could erase the shift that had taken place. Maria hadn't confronted her. She hadn't thrown the insult back. That would have been easier to dismiss. But instead, she'd remained composed, professional, powerful, and that silence, that dignity made everything sting more deeply. A few days later, the contract was signed. Not because Genevieve insisted, but because Brad, her husband, reviewed the details and found the pricing competitive and the services unmatched. He hadn't picked up on the history behind the meeting, and Genevieve chose not to elaborate. The papers were finalized, and the first service date was scheduled. Maria did not return for the cleaning, her team did, arriving in branded vehicles with coordinated uniforms and clipboards in hand. They moved efficiently through the house, polite and focused. Genevieve watched them from the staircase as they worked, the familiarity of Maria's logo printed neatly on their shirts making her pulse quicken. She offered them coffee, trying to regain some sense of authority. One of the supervisors smiled politely, declined, and continued with her checklist. There was no arrogance in the way the team worked, but everything about them exuded order and competence. Every polished surface, every aligned towel, every labeled bottle in the laundry room reminded Genevieve of who had built this company and who now held the higher ground. Maria, meanwhile, was in her office reviewing expansion plans. A new commercial client had signed in Long Beach, and she was finalizing negotiations for a regional training center. She hadn't thought much about the meeting since leaving the Halvorsons' home. There had been no satisfaction in the encounter, only the calm fulfillment that comes when the truth stands fully revealed. She didn't speak of it to her staff, didn't boast about the quiet reversal that had unfolded. For Maria, the best outcomes were the ones that spoke without noise. Reputation wasn't something she needed to wave around. It carried itself. Still, the encounter stirred something. Not resentment, but a renewed clarity. The more successful she became, the more she realized how deeply bias ran, not just in individuals, but in systems, in rooms, in reflexes. She had spent years managing both perceptions and logistics. Now she had the luxury of choosing which rooms she entered and which she simply supplied. And with that freedom came responsibility, not to expose the Genevieves of the world, but to make space for women like her to rise without needing to shrink first. At the end of that week, Maria hosted a quarterly leadership meeting for her regional supervisors. They gathered in the conference room, laptops open, company folders neatly stacked in front of them. She led the session with calm authority, reviewing financials, staff metrics, and upcoming marketing initiatives. Then, toward the end, she paused and offered a different kind of message. She spoke about dignity, about not just providing cleaning services, but restoring respect in spaces where it had long been absent. She talked about how their work went unnoticed only by those who never understood its value, and how, ironically, their invisibility was what made their excellence possible. When no one expects you to be extraordinary, every success becomes undeniable. One of the younger managers raised her hand and asked Maria what had kept her going through the early years when people didn't listen, when doors closed. Maria paused for a moment before answering. She said it was the knowledge that no one would ever hand her power, so she would have to build it herself. Brick by brick, client by client. And once it was built, it would not be questioned. After the meeting, as the team dispersed, Maria stood alone for a moment in the center of the room. She looked at the walls covered in whiteboards and charts, at the logos printed on the binders, at the quiet hum of her company breathing and growing around her. This was the room she belonged in, not because she had earned her way into someone else's space, but because she had created her own. Across the city, Genevieve sat on her patio, sipping wine and watching the cleaning team pull out of the driveway. She hadn't spoken to Maria since that meeting, and she likely never would. But she thought about her often now, thought about the ease with which she had handled that encounter, thought about the restraint, the poise. And for the first time in a long while, Genevieve found herself genuinely reflecting, not out of guilt, but out of the discomfort that comes when someone quietly challenges the version of the world you thought was fixed. Respect, she realized, was not given to the loudest or the richest. It was commanded by presence, earned through resilience, and revealed by time. And Maria had all three. The morning sun filtered gently through the large windows of Maria's home, casting warm streaks of light across the tiled kitchen floor. The scent of brewing coffee mingled with the soft sizzle of eggs on the stove. Her son sat at the breakfast bar, hunched over a workbook, occasionally asking questions between bites of toast. It was a typical Saturday. Quiet, unhurried, grounded in simplicity. Maria moved through the kitchen with the comfort of routine, pouring orange juice, checking her phone for messages, and replying to a few emails that had come in overnight. Most were from team leads, small updates, nothing urgent. She liked that. It meant the systems she'd built worked without her having to monitor every detail. She had no client meetings scheduled that day, no on-site walkthroughs or investor calls. Just time. Time to breathe, reflect, and plan. After breakfast, she retreated to her home office, a sunlit room adorned with minimal decor but full of intention. One wall held a framed map of California, small flags pinned across various cities, each marking a branch she had opened. Another wall bore a large calendar, color-coded by region, noting upcoming service transitions, training sessions, and quarterly goals. Below it sat a shelf filled with binders, awards, and a few thank you cards from longtime clients. There were no pictures of her in a uniform, not because she was ashamed of her past, but because she didn't need to prove it anymore. The journey was written into every line of her company's growth. She sat at her desk and opened a spreadsheet tracking regional performance. The numbers were promising. Client retention was up. Employee turnover had dropped significantly since they'd introduced new benefits and wellness initiatives. Contracts with corporate accounts continued to grow. But Maria wasn't smiling because of numbers. She felt content because the work no longer defined her. It reflected her. The difference was subtle but profound. She had built something lasting, not just a company, but a culture. One where people with stories like hers weren't treated as background noise, where they led. Later that day, she met with a small group of female entrepreneurs at a local community center. It was part of a mentoring program she had quietly funded for the past 2 years. The women ranged in age and background, some with fledgling ideas, others already running small operations out of their homes. Maria listened more than she spoke. She offered guidance where asked, shared templates, walked through vendor strategies, discussed the challenges of scaling when no one in the room looked like the typical CEO. She didn't glamorize the hard parts. She acknowledged them. And by doing so, she gave the others permission to take themselves seriously. One woman, nervous and new, asked what it felt like to finally make it. Maria paused, then answered with a clarity that came from experience. There was no finally. There was only the next decision, the next person you uplift, the next space you enter knowing you deserve to be there. Success wasn't a destination. It was a series of quiet affirmations stacked like bricks, solidified over time. And she had learned that the most powerful thing a woman could do was stop asking for permission. That night, as dusk settled over the hills, Maria returned home and stood for a long moment in her backyard. Her garden was quiet, lit by soft lanterns and the rustle of wind through citrus trees. She walked the stone path slowly, letting the week fade from her shoulders. She thought of all the people who had underestimated her, who had seen only the uniform, the accent, the silence. She remembered every closed door, every dismissive smile, every shallow laugh that tried to reduce her worth. And then she thought of the people who had believed in her, her son, her early clients, her staff, her mentors. Their faces carried more weight. They were the ones who mattered. In her living room, a corkboard held pinned photos from the last company retreat. Group shots, candid laughter, a banner that read "Built by us, for us." It was more than branding. It was truth. Maria sat on the couch, legs curled beneath her, and opened her laptop to one final email, a message from a commercial real estate developer in Northern California. They were expanding, looking for a full-service provider. They'd heard of her firm through a client referral. The opportunity was big, ambitious, and precisely the kind of challenge she once thought was reserved for others. She drafted a reply, calm and confident, outlining her availability for a meeting. Then she closed the laptop and leaned back. For so long, her success had been measured in silent victories. Now it echoed in boardrooms, in contracts, in the way people spoke her name with respect. She had no need for revenge. The world had already rewritten its rules around her, one accomplishment at a time. The woman once dismissed as just a maid now ran an operation that reached every corner of the state. And she did it without shouting, without demanding attention. She built her empire quietly, thoroughly, unapologetically. Maria rose, switched off the lamp, and moved toward the hallway, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The house was dark, but not empty. It was full, with purpose, with history, with future. As she passed by the mirror near the entryway, she caught a glimpse of herself, not the girl who once scrubbed floors, not the woman belittled in a penthouse, but the founder who had turned every dismissal into momentum. Outside, the city buzzed and glittered, unaware that a revolution had passed through it, wearing work shoes, carrying cleaning supplies, and never asking for the world's approval. Maria had become her own definition of power, and nothing would ever erase that.